Nature is many things. It can be bountiful and dangerous, inviting yet foreboding. It freely bestows the many means from which life can truly thrive, but it's always prepared to take back what belongs to it when given enough time. Gridania is a nation steeped in that natural order, so instead of trying to force it into submission, its people peacefully move alongside it as best they can. But things don't always go as well as you'd think. A certain set of prison ruins became a perfect example of that. So gather around, my friends, as we come to understand the dangers lurking within the 1,000 maws of Toto-Rak. Getting its name from a man-eating monster of Pajali folklore, this literal dungeon was originally a natural system of almost countless winding caves and tunnels. As you can suspect, it would have served the Gelmorans and early Gridanians very well. This would explain why the interior of the caves possess masonry that's reminiscent of Gelmor's mastery over stone shaping. But despite how majestic these caves were, they would serve an unfortunate purpose. The 1,000 maws of Toto-Rak would become Gridania's first set of supermax prison cells. Back when Gridania was young and the Gelmorans steadily began their transition into a surface-dwelling city-state, it's reasonable to assume that not all would go well. There were dissenters who believed that giving into the demands of the elementals was foolish, and that such beings could never be entirely trusted with the happiness and safety of the mortal races. These men and women would damage the forest on purpose, trying to set fire to early homes and many trees. Not only that, but many Keeper of the Moon Makote had also begun moving into and attempting to settle within the Black Shroud, causing a sudden rise in things like poaching and banditry. Eventually, the worst offenders belonging to some of these circles would indeed be caught. But even a young Gridania was not barbaric. They wouldn't simply execute these people to please the elementals who were now out for blood. Instead, they turned the many caves of Toto-Rak into a specialized prison, designed to contain the worst of the worst. From arson to murder, poaching to thievery, those who proved too problematic would be sent to Toto-Rak. These caves have a harrowing history to them. The people who were once contained here held no love for their fellow man, only ever thinking for themselves, their gains, and their pleasures. As such, the air of these ruins is sometimes thick with malice, as Toto-Rak's dense aether would unknowingly hold on to these sentiments. But this would not be Gridania's favored prison forever. Two things would occur that eventually led to Toto-Rak's complete abandonment. The first was the changing of Gridania's primary location. Originally, when the nation was still young, it mostly operated out of Quarry Mill, which meant that Toto-Rak was not too far from the budding homestead. But once the nation's capital had been moved much further north, Toto-Rak was no longer an ideal location. It was too much of a distance from the city to properly distribute seasoned guards and personnel to the location. Simply put, it was too far out of the way. Secondly, the natural aether within Toto-Rak was becoming strange. While Eorzea has ever been a place of thickly packed aether when compared to the rest of the world, the flow of such aether through Toto-Rak was becoming too strangely dense, making the zone more and more hazardous to the mortal races. Instead of leaving the prisoners of the jail to their fate, a brand new prison was built to replace Toto-Rak. This prison was closer to Gridania's capital, and therefore easier to manage. Once all of the prisoners and resources were moved from their old dungeon to their newly secured location, the 1,000 maws of Toto-Rak became completely abandoned, and its halls rang empty. Many would say that this choice couldn't have been made sooner, as the following years would leave Toto-Rak as an even more hostile and dangerous place despite the lack of evil individuals. The sudden density of aether within the caves, combined with the ruin of the Seventh Umbral Calamity, left the cave system completely uninhabitable. The change in Aether had become a perfect breeding ground for dangerous flora and fauna, a nesting ground for various monsters. Not only that, but Bahamut's rampage had left many of the unmaintained tunnels horribly unstable. Cave-ins became all too common, and the fallen rubble had now blocked off most of the cave's many pathways. Perhaps this was for the best, as the creatures lurking within Toto-Rak had started to become ravenous. More and more monsters began to pour from the mouth of this cave as time went on, and eventually it became so much that an expedition was created to determine what has become of these caves. The leader of this expedition was First Spear Rydell. Rydell notes that the fauna was surprisingly hostile upon entering the caves, confirming Gridania's suspicion that the Thousand Malls of Toto-Rak were no longer as abandoned as they had hoped. But, regardless of the danger, they needed to press onward, and gauge just how many monsters had chosen to make these unholy caves their home. Unfortunately for Rydell and the expedition, things only got worse the deeper they went into the caves. The creatures had the opportunity to multiply and gather their strength deep in the recesses of these caverns, and were proving mightier than expected. Rydell's party suffered some casualties, but still they pressed on, determined to find the source of why all these creatures were worked into a frenzy. And eventually, they found it. At the heart of these abandoned ruins were scores upon scores of Diremites that had made the central network of these caves their home. For those unaware, Diremites are a monster type belonging to the Vilekin classification. Vilekin is the title applied to creatures of the insectoid variety, defining all sorts of pests, worms, and arachnids. The Diremites themselves are an almost constant problem. They're a nomadic type of monster that will settle an area, ruthlessly multiply, and then ravage all of the surrounding creatures in order to sustain themselves before moving on to a newer and more fertile patch of land. They're a menace that acts almost like a plague upon nature itself. After realizing how intense the situation with the Diremites truly was, Rydell realized they were ill-equipped to handle such a large-scale infestation. As such, their expedition called for a full retreat. While not successful in dealing with the core of the problem, Rydell's party managed to not only secure the entrance to Toto-Rak, but deal a heavy blow to the monsters lurking around much of the cave's tunnels. This would make subsequent raids that much easier and less lethal. But eventually, the problems stemming from the caves would rear its ugly head once more, as even greater amounts of suspicious activity would be found around the caves. Rumors of men cloaked in black robes, as well as the increasing threat of aggressive Diremites, would encourage Gridania to throw open Toto-Rak's doors and send in a special task force of adventurers to strike at the heart of this plague. Eventually, through various trials and tribulations, the adventurers would triumph over the tunnels of Toto-Rak, even slaying a Banemite named Graphius. Without a Banemite to constantly lay more eggs for their brood, the Diremite population within the area was brought back into Gridania's control. While the tunnels of Toto-Rak may never see true habitation again by the races of man, it's good to know that it's no longer a place where the most wicked men and women reside, or a place where monsters fester before attacking innocent people. In that respect, Toto-Rak was a home for two different breeds of monsters over the course of its life. One that knew better but chose violence, and another that only knew violence. Hopefully, we may never worry too much about it in the far-flung future, especially now that the tunnel's aether has begun to normalize in the 5 years since the 7th Umbral Calamity. But, in the meantime, it never hurts to remain on guard and keep an eye on the once dangerous grounds of these caves. After all, it has ever lived up to its namesake, and the 1,000 Maws of Toto-Rak may yet swallow even more victims should they be unprepared. So until next we meet, remain vigilant, and stay safe, my friends. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Big shout out to my patrons, Rovakis, Potato, Runeteer, the Yellow Couch, Papaya, Cyan, Sage Mouse, and Volvolisoma. If you want to see more lore content in the future, share this with your friends. My dream is to share as much as I find with as many people as possible. And if you do end up helping me, thank you so much in advance. And have a wonderful day.